Hi and welcome to this Ignite Webcast. My name is Josh Topal and I'm a Program Manager for Office 365. Ignite events are a series of technical workshops for IT professionals and Microsoft partners. And the Ignite Webcast series will address different technical subjects and scenarios that are really beneficial to anyone who wants to increase their knowledge of the Office 365 suite. So today we're really happy to have Daniel Kenyon-Smith here today to speak to us about understanding identities and single sign-on. Daniel is an Office 365 architect, and he's joining us today from the UK. So today's sessions will provide a great opportunity to hear directly from a Microsoft employee and learn about some of the new features and releases for Office 365. So if you haven't been to a webcast, let me tell you how it works. The presentation will be about an hour, and we'll leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end to field questions from anyone on the call. So please hold all your questions till the end for the Q&A section. And when that time comes, you can go ahead and type your questions into the link chat box, and we're going to try our best to get to all of them. So one last thing, we are recording today's session, and we'll have the slideshow and the video available online, and you can find that on the original Ignite blog post and the Office 365 community blog post. You can also find the video recording on the Office 365 YouTube channel. And I'm going to post both of those in the window right now. So that's it for me. So Daniel, whenever you're ready, we can begin.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. So my name's Dan Kenyon-Smith. As Josh said, work for Microsoft Consultancies Services in the UK. With that, we'll just jump straight into the agenda. So initially, we're going to have a look at some identity scenarios, and then we'll look at some federation and synchronization, and then we'll sort of delve into some additional features and sort of functionality that's available with the identity. Okay. So what is identity management? So essentially it's being able to identify specific individuals and what those individuals have access to, so whether that's resources or whether that's applications. So there's a couple of scenarios with regards to identity. These identity providers. An identity provider is an organization that wants to provide their users access to something like partner, hosted or cloud-based services and applications. So that would be your own local identity Active Directory, for example. We also have a resource provider, and they're organizations that want to make their applications and services available to other users and organizations. So that could be hosted environments, and Office 365 being an example of that. And then we've got things like authentication and authorization. So authentication is who you say you are and authorizing that. So essentially, being able to validate who you say you are. So an example of that is obviously your own passport validates you are who you say you are. And of course, in the Office 365 scenario is providing your details, so your UPN, which is your user principal name, and your password in order to be able to validate you are who you say you are. And then once you've validated you are who you say you are, then you need to look at what access you've got. So the example again of Office 365 is essentially saying whether you're just logging in as a standard user or whether you may be something like a global administrator where you can sort of add, register and verify domains, so what you can actually do once you've logged onto the system. We said then that we've got these core identity scenarios within Office 365. So there are essentially three scenarios. We will sort of dive into these in a little bit more detail, but the sort of high-level overview is the first one we've got is a cloud identity. So essentially the cloud identity is where your user account and identity is stored in Office 365 in this example. Well, it's actually stored in Windows Azure Active Directory. And that's typically used for smaller based companies that require no integration to your existing on-premise environment. So you don't have an on-premise Active Directory or identity solution, and you don't want to integrate, anything like your email, for example, and you don't want to run what we have as hybrid. And we do have another session actually in a few weeks about exactly what hybrid is and how that works in more detail. So that we're not going to cover certainly the Exchange hybrid piece today, but like I say, there is another session on that which we'll dive into. One of the other core identity scenarios is Active Directory with password synchronization. So you see we've got a little asterisk on there, and a little caveat down the bottom there is essentially saying that the password synchronization is not available yet, and it's looking like it will be available, but obviously these dates are subject to change for the first half of this calendar year. So this is sort of fairly new technology, so whatever we discuss with regards to password synchronization is not set in stone at the moment, and obviously is subject to change. But essentially the password synchronization is different from federation in that you don't actually require to maintain any ADFS, so Active Directory Federation Services infrastructure on premise. And the password synchronization feature is fully integrated into directory sync, or DIRSync as I may end up referring to. But what it does do is it does align to things like the customer's cloud strategy. So if you're looking to keep your deployment simple, it removes any additional costs association with having to implement that ADFS component on premise and maintain that on-premise infrastructure. So essentially you have your on-prem identity, Active Directory for example, you would need the directory sync server, and then obviously we synchronize those passwords up into Office 365. Now, a couple of points to note there is that the password sync will apply at the tenant level, so once that's enabled it'll apply to all users that are within that directory sync scope, and we'll talk around the different options around directory sync scoping later on in this presentation. But essentially once it's enabled for one, it's enabled for them all users, and can't be enabled only for a subset. So one-way synchronization, so again we're synchronizing from on-premise up into Office 365, so all of your identity management is managed on-premise, so new user provisioning, groups and updating of attributes is all done on-premise, and then directory sync will synchronize those changes up into Office 365. From a security perspective, your Active Directory password policies will apply on-premise, so that's not any policies that would apply to Office 365, it's your on-premise password policies that would apply to those user accounts. And the actual passwords themselves are not synchronized, it's actually a password hash that's synchronized. And the hash itself is transmitted to Office 365, obviously over a secure channel, and there is no requirement to enable reversible password encryption in your local Active Directory. So reversible password encryption is essentially where you're keeping your passwords in plain text. That's not required. And the final scenario is the typical scenario that I've been working with a lot of customers around, certainly over the last few years, is around the ADFS Active Directory Federation Services, where we would typically have the ADFS, we've got some proxy servers, they sit in the DMZ, and your ADFS internal servers would talk directly to Active Directory, and then we would have a separate directory sync up into Office 365. And again, we'll mention some of the different types of directory sync, but again, we've got another section that's set up that's dedicated for directory sync and the different options, but we will cover them at a high level inside this session. So essentially, we have the on-premises identity, as we've said before, in the last scenario there. Active Directory, we have the ADFS infrastructure set up on-prem, and we have directory sync synchronizing those changes up into Office 365. So let's just have a look at these in a little bit more detail then. So essentially the cloud identity, as we've said, the user accounts themselves will be stored in the Windows Azure Active Directory up into the cloud. That's where you would authenticate and authorize what access you've got directly in Office 365. So there is no hybrid configuration in this scenario. We're just saying that everything is actually hosted in the cloud. So obviously that's a lower cost. There is no additional on-premise servers required, such as the Adfs or the directory sync, and everything's managed and controlled through the Office 365 portal or through the PowerShell interface, but essentially it's all managed through Office 365. So as we've said, it's a lower cost, no servers, high availability and reliable. So obviously the SLAs that are provided by Office 365 is what you would be signing up for when you move to Office 365 with a cloud identity. And then we've got the password sync and password synchronization. So as we've said, we've got the on-premise Active Directory infrastructure, and we would have directory sync server installed and then synchronizing passwords up into Office 365 or into the Windows Azure Active Directory. The identities are managed and created on-premise, as we've said before, and they would be obviously then synchronized up using the directory sync tool. And your identities, you will actually have an identity in Office 365 and an identity on-premise, because essentially you've got two authentication realms, one on-premise and one in Office 365. Therefore, we do synchronize the passwords up there. You would actually be prompted when accessing any services in Office 365 for the password, which of course you can type that password in, tick the save password box, and then obviously that wouldn't be prompted again until your password is actually expired on-premise. And as we said, all these password policies are identified on-prem. There are some other different options around directory sync, which we'll come to later, such as multi-forest. And for a multi-forest, for example, you would require FIM, which is Forefront Identity Manager, as opposed to the standard directory sync appliance. Now, if you use to implement FIM for the multi-forest or for non-active directories, such as Shibboleth, which again we'll come to in a minute, that you just need to be aware that from a FIM perspective, you do need to have a license for the FIM server, as of where you don't for the standard directory sync tool. And the standard directory sync tool also does password synchronization as well. But if you are going to implement FIM, as well as having that FIM server license, you may possibly want things like Visual Studio as well, because Visual Studio can be used for coding the FIM rule extensions. And again, just a caveat here that password synchronization is not currently available and is hoping to be available in the first half of the calendar year. And the benefit of the password synchronization is we don't have to implement the infrastructure for Adfs, which is what we are going to talk about here. So this is the Identity Federation, the sort of typical standards option that we've had. Obviously, those have now sort of extended out to this password synchronization option, but essentially where we would have the Adfs proxy servers sitting in the DMZ, and they would then communicate to the internal Adfs servers, which in turn would talk to Active Directory to authenticate you into Office 365. Again, all your identities managed on-premise, so single point of management. All of those objects and attributes would synchronize up into Office 365. So, for example, if you was to try and go into the portal, you would see that the objects that are synchronized from on-prem are not editable, because obviously you need to manage and master those from on-premise. So any changes that you would make, you would need to make those on-premise and then synchronize those up into Office 365. Synchronization would occur every 3 hours by default, but you can manually force synchronization if you want to force the delta changes up into Office 365 immediately without waiting for that next cycle within that 3 hours. Another thing that we will touch on as well before the end of the session is around being able to limit client access control based on IP addresses. So it essentially allows us to put ADFS client policy rules to say where you're coming from as to whether you can actually access Office 365 or your mailbox, for example, in Office 365 or not. So the example there is if you're at home or in an internet cafe, you can block users from accessing their mailbox unless they're coming from a corporate IP address, which would then allow them to be able to, would need them to VPN in, and that may be, a two-factor authentication requirement as well. Okay. So we've got some federation and synchronization options. So we've got the standard ADFS, which we've talked around here. So the federation. So this is, the most recommended option from a Microsoft perspective, and offers the most support and best customer experience. Obviously allows you to move with the evolving, Microsoft identity strategy. It obviously works with Active Directory on premise, and it supports all of the web and rich client scenarios. We've also got something called phone factor as well. Phone factor is basically a two-factor authentication solution, a typical two-factor authentication solution where it would send things like text messages or even a call, for example, to give you that second factor. And of course it integrates with Active Directory, as I said, fully supported, and it works with Office 365 hybrid scenarios. So that's where we're saying you've obviously got your on-premise infrastructure, and you obviously require the server installations, the licensing to go with that. But it does support that hybrid scenario where you've still got on-premise infrastructure. You want to integrate that to Office 365. And that obviously works with things like Exchange and Link as well. Other option that we have is around third-party STSs. So STS meaning secure token systems, and this is a good option if you've got customers that are currently using third-party identity systems in their infrastructure already. So you want to leverage their existing setup or third-party solution. Can work with both on-prem AD and non-AD stores, so additional LDAP directories, and will support all web and rich client scenarios. Now these third-party STSs have all been verified through a program which is called Works with Office 365, and actually we've got a slide on that after this one, so we'll talk a little bit more about that next. And then of course we've got Shibboleth, which also works with AD and non-AD. So again, some organizations, might have directories other than Active Directory, such as an LDAP directory and a SAML2. So SAML2 is security assertion markup language and is based on STS such as Shibboleth, and you may want to use that existing infrastructure to be able to connect that up to Office 365 without having to migrate to Active Directory, for example. So this is the program I was just mentioning there, Works with Office 365, where it's an interoperability program to enable STS, so again secure token systems, to interoperate with Office 365. Basically the key objective of this program is to enable customers with third-party identity solutions to be able to adopt Office 365, and only third-party providers are supported. So as we can see on here, there's some third-party providers have been listed. You may be aware of some of them already. The slight caveat to this one is IBM, CA and Novell are all web only. So we'll talk around the different authentication endpoints when accessing Office 365 fairly soon, but essentially web only is obviously things like SharePoint and things like Outlook Web Access, for example. There's no support for the rich client, which is full fat Outlook, and there's no support for link either. So I'll just sort of work that slide through. So with this program that works with Office 365, we're essentially saying that we're being flexible. So we're allowing existing customers to use any investments that they have on premise. So if you're using Ping Federate, for example, for your single sign-on or identity solution, then we can reuse that. That has been validated against Office 365. We're also as these partners have gone through this particular program, they've all been verified by Microsoft and certified, so giving partners and customers confidence that that solution will work against Office 365. And obviously Microsoft have been working with a close relationship with each of these partners to ensure that the customer gets a good experience with regards to support with any issues with that particular product. Directory synchronization options then. So, like I say, we've got a specific session around directory sync, and there are various different options for synchronizing your objects from on-premise to Office 365. And we essentially synchronize to allow us to have things like a unified GAL, for example, for Exchange. So if you are mastering all of your objects on premise, then that's where you would create all of your accounts, all of your provisioning, and then synchronize that up to Office 365. So there are various options for directory sync. We've got the standard of DIRSync or directory sync appliance, as it's called, which is a standard installation of directory sync, which is almost a next install. You obviously need a server to install that on, and we'll talk about what the requirements are for that again in a few more slides. But that's for your sort of standard, single forest synchronizing up into Office 365. When you run through the install, you do have some options to have some Exchange coexistence if you want to do the Exchange hybrid piece, which briefly mentioned earlier. And again, we do have another session on that in a few weeks. When you enable the coexistence, it essentially allows you to write back some objects from Office 365 back to your on-premise environment. I can't remember how many, I think it's about 6 attributes, something like that. One of those attributes, or an example of one of those attributes, is things like if you want to use the Office 365 the online archive. So you may want to have an archive in Office 365, but actually your live mailbox on-prem, for example. So it will write back some attributes so you know where that archive is located. Again, as part of this, we can provide password synchronization as part of the default directory sync. And you don't require any license for directory sync, but of course you need a server to be able to install that on to synchronize up to Office 365. And then we have what is called the Office 365 connector. So this is fairly new and can only be deployed through Microsoft services and quite recently through Microsoft partners as well. So it's not available as a download as directory sync is. And essentially the Office 365 connector is used for either large or complex environments or non-active directory scenarios. So you may have a multiple forest environment on premise, for example, and if you do, you wouldn't be able to use the standard directory sync. You would need to use the Office 365 connector, which would then use FIM, which is the Forefront Identity Manager. And as we mentioned earlier, you do require a Forefront Identity Manager server license, obviously as well as the OS, in order to be able to run the Office 365 connector. And then we've got the PowerShell and Graph API. So Windows Azure AD Graph basically provides a programmatic way to access Windows Azure and it does this through REST API endpoints. So AD graph developers can execute, create, run, update and delete, which is called CRUD, C-R-U-D, operations on Windows AD objects, such as users and groups. So in the on-premise world, you would essentially be using something like ADSI edit, and in the cloud, you would use Windows Azure AD graph, just to give you a bit of an example. A couple of things to note about that is the PowerShell or graph are not designed for synchronization. So operations will take slightly longer because we have some server-side throttling, and there's some features that are not supported in the PowerShell or graph provisioning. So if you've got a large number of users, we recommend using either directory sync or FIM for the reasons I've just mentioned there, but the primary reason is around to that server-side throttling and performance reasons. So the roadmap here, just to give you a bit of a heads up as to what to expect. So we've got some shibboleth SAML support is available now. As we've said, we've got this program which is called Works with Office 365, and these are where partners can come in and validate their own solutions up against Office 365. As we said, we've got Novell, CA, and there's Oracle that don't provide all access to Office 365. They're just web-based, and they'll be available in the first half of the calendar year, this year. We've got the directory sync multi-forest AD, which we've just talked about, multiple forests, more of a complex scenario, and they're available through MCS, Microsoft Premier Deployment, and now available through partners. And that's exactly the same for the password synchronization solution using FIM and for non-AD. Oh, sorry, that's just the synchronization solution. Sorry, the password synchronization, as we said, is not available till the first half of this year, and also we're going to be looking at doing some broader SAML support as well, which is not available till the first half of this year as well. Okay, so just going to dive into some more details here, just into a bit more around sort of ADFS. We did mention that you are going to require a server in order to be able to install ADFS. So currently we only support Windows 2008 or Windows 2008 R2, and we're currently not supporting, although obviously we will be fairly soon, but there's no timelines on that at the moment, for Server 2012. When you install ADFS, we install the web IIS, .NET and Identity Foundations. We've got publicly registered and rootable domain name, so we need to have a publicly registered and rootable domain name. Now, essentially, we said that right at the beginning of this presentation, for authentication, you needed to type in your UPN, your user principal name. So, as part, obviously, that's critical then to be able to access your resources within Office 365. So, we need to make sure, as part of your on-premise remediation, that each user has a valid UPN assigned to them, and that UPN has been registered in Office 365. Now we do support, we require Ssl certificates, so publicly facing the Ssl certs. We also support wildcard certs, and we just got a little bullet, a little star down at the bottom there, which talks about wildcard certificates. So if you're well, essentially you would normally be having multiple ADFS servers in a ADFS farm, and that would obviously be dependent on your requirements as to whether you had one particular location and therefore you had two ADFS servers, two proxies to give you HA, or whether you had multiple sites and therefore wanted to provide either a global load balance across those two sites, or whether you provide sort of an active passive. But essentially, when you create the ADFS farm and you add the second server into the farm using the GUI, you essentially get an error because the name doesn't match the wildcard cert. So if you are using wildcard certs, you'd have to use the command line fsconfig tool to be able to add in the second server into the farm if you've got a wildcard cert. So we also mentioned around the high availability. So you could have HA in one location, or DR or global load balancing across multiple locations. But depending on how many servers you want in that particular farm, so how many ADFS servers you have in that particular farm, depends on whether you would use the Windows internal database, which is the WID, or whether you would actually use full SQL. So with the WID, it works as a primary and secondary. So obviously the primary server updates the services and the secondary node isn't able to modify the database, it just gets the replication from the primary. So in this particular configuration there is two features that can be implemented and rely on the fact that you need to be able to change the database directly from both nodes. And that is the SAML artifact resolution and token replay detection. So token replay detection, just for example, is when you've logged in through a browser and then you click back, it will then prompt you to re-authenticate and not reuse the existing token. So if you have specific requirements around replay detection or artifact stores or resolution, then you would need to implement full SQL as the back end for your ADFS servers. Or if you want to have more than 5 servers in your farm, WID would only support up to 5 servers. So if you want 6 servers, SAML replay detection and artifact resolution, then you would need to use full SQL. Now most customers that have 2 sites would have 2 ADFS servers in one location and 2 ADFS servers in another location. Therefore, you can still utilize the WID. There's very few customers that I've worked with that have required full SQL as the back end for their ADFS infrastructure and setup. And that's just for the ADFS servers, of course. That's not including the proxy servers that sit in front of ADFS. So that's just 5 federation servers. It's the maximum, not including proxies. Right, so we've got different types of endpoints when connecting to Office 365. We've essentially got 3 endpoints, and depending on how you access Office 365 depends on which endpoint you will be connecting to. So we've got the active endpoint, which is called MEX, the metadata exchange, and that's used for supporting things like link and Office subscription. And we've got the basic authentication, which is called the also the active profile. Can be quite confusing with the first bullet. And essentially that is where we do a basic proxy auth for Exchange Online. So when you're using things like ActiveSync, full rich Outlook client, IMAP POP, SMTP, or things like EWS, basically all of your clients will connect directly to Exchange Online, and then Exchange Online will proxy on your behalf to the ADFS proxy server. Now we've got a slide on this coming up next, which hopefully might explain that a little bit more, because depending on the scenario that you're in, depends on whether you would go through the ADFS proxy or whether you would connect directly to the ADFS server that's on the internal network. And then we've got the passive profile. So the passive profile is for browsers. So that's where essentially you'd log onto your network using your laptop, connected to your domain, type in your username and password. You open up or SharePoint and you access some of the web documents. That's where it would just seamlessly single sign you on access into those locations, whether it be SharePoint or so the passive one is obviously seamless from that perspective, from the authentication perspective. So we have a slide here which is understanding what we just talked about there. So we said there's 3 different endpoints. There's the MEX, we've got this sort of web, which is the passive, and we've got the active endpoint. So if I'm on the internal network, so we can see we've got sort of a dotted line cutting straight through the ADFS proxy server, and that's the corporate boundary. So anybody to the left of that is on the internal network, and then anybody to the right of that where Exchange Online is showing in this diagram is effectively out onto the internet. So depending on where you are and what you're actually accessing with regards to Office 365 depends on how you access that particular service and how that authentication path is processed. So if you're using Link, for example, and you're on the internal network, as we've said, Link will connect to that MEX endpoint, which is the exchange endpoint, metadata exchange endpoint. You would use Windows Integrated Auth. You've already logged on to your internal network, and therefore you have already authenticated. That authentication is passed directly to the Adfs server, and you're essentially accessing your Link Online client and subscription. The same for OR. So again, we've said with a browser, so you open up your browser once you've already logged on to the internal network, and this time we go to the passive profile, and again you type in the URL and it will log you straight into your OWA and access your mailbox. Now if you're using Outlook 2010, 2007, the full rich client or ActiveSync, we've said you would always go through Exchange Online. So Exchange Online always proxies on your behalf. So even though you're on the internal network and you've already logged into your corporate credentials, what will happen is the Outlook client will determine that your mailbox is in Exchange Online. It will connect to Exchange Online. Exchange Online will then look to see what your UPN is, so user@company.com. It will realize that company.com is federated, so using ADFS, we've connected our ADFS on-premise servers to Office 365 and told them that company.com is a federated domain. So when I type in user@company.com to access my Exchange Online mailbox, it goes, oh, you're a federated domain, and it will then connect to the name of that federation farm, which may be federation.company.com. And essentially then Exchange Online will proxy through the ADFS proxy into the internal network, get your token, pass it to Exchange Online. Exchange Online will verify that and then pass that information back through to the client. So regardless of whether you're internal or external, you will always do a proxy through Exchange Online. It will always proxy on your behalf and carry that information through. So hopefully that makes sense. So one of the other thing we can do is around client access control. So we can, using ADFS and ADFS proxies, is essentially limit where a client can access Office 365 from. So a couple of examples that we've got here, and there is actually a TechNet article that describes this in more detail and also describes some of the actual claims-based rules that you can set up. But essentially, if you wanted to block all external access to Office 365 except Exchange ActiveSync, so that would mean that if you wanted to access Office 365 from an internet cafe, you wouldn't be allowed to access. So as part of the rule, what you do is you essentially say, I will allow anybody to access Office 365 using Outlook, but only when you come from this specific IP address. So again, I go into an internet cafe, I'm not coming from the specified IP address in the rule, therefore don't match the rule, therefore denied access. When I open up my Outlook client at home or open up my laptop at home, I VPN in to the internal network and access Office 365 through my corporate network, and therefore exit through the egress points of my network, therefore match the IP addresses that I've got in the rule. I would then be allowed access to my mailbox. So one of the key things about implementing these client access rules is that you essentially need to make sure that the IP addresses that you've got in your rule are correct and not only are they correct, they actually match where users would be coming out of your internal network from. So you need to engage your networking team in order to fully understand the network routing and the IP addresses that your clients will be connecting from when you're implementing these client-based rules. So if you miss one IP address, for example, out of a remote location, a user tries to authenticate, they'll essentially keep getting authentication prompts because they don't match the IP address, therefore they can't authenticate to the service, to the mailbox, and obviously the user experience is not great, and obviously they can't access the mailbox either. So definitely engaging the network teams if you want to apply any of these type of policies is definitely a good idea. Now, most customers that I've worked with that have implemented client-based client access control rules is because they want to meet a two-factor authentication requirement. So currently, full rich Outlook client doesn't natively support two-factor authentication. So if you want to provide a two-factor authentication to Office 365, then you would need to implement client-based rules, which would then mean when I get home, again, open up my laptop, start my VPN, then use my existing two-factor authentication to log into the corporate network and then access Office 365 through the corporate network, therefore meeting that two-factor authentication requirement, so utilizing the existing two-factor authentication solutions that you've already got in place. One other thing to note as well, down at the bottom of here again, is just some notes from the field, is that there is a client access policy builder. So just do a search using your favorite search engine and do a search for client access policy builder, and there's a little tool that you can download, and you just punch that into a GUI, and then it'll just sort of spell out the rule that you want to apply. So it's only if they're fairly basic rules. If you want to start getting a bit more complicated with those rules, then you need to configure those yourself. But if you've got some basic requirements, then you can punch them into this builder, and then it'll just give you the results, which is pretty good actually. Another thing as well is make sure you test these rules. So we've got some customers that have wanted to apply these rules after they've got thousands of users on. So obviously that's going to impact all of those users if they get the rule wrong. So make sure you can test those rules either in a test environment somewhere, or you can test it before you start moving live users over onto the service, and just have a look through the default logs to see if you've got any denied authorization values. Okay. So directory sync. Again, we've got a more detailed session for directory sync coming up in a few weeks, but directory sync essentially needs to be joined to the domain. So this is a standard DIRSync appliance, just to caveat that this is not the FIM appliance, this is the standard DIRSync. It needs to be joined to the domain essentially in the same forest that you'll be synchronizing from. And as we've said, the directory sync appliance, the standard appliance, only supports a single forest anyway. If you wanted to have multiple forests, then you'd be looking at the multi-forest solution, which would be the FIM piece, the Forefront Identity Manager. Again, as a best practice, which with most things we don't recommend that you install directory sync on a domain controller. At the moment, directory sync only supports 64 bits, so we did have a 32-bit directory sync binaries, but then they're no longer supported now. So if you download the directory sync tool, which you can get through the portal, then you will be downloading the 64-bit version anyway. And one other thing to note on there as well is around the size of the SQL database. So when you install directory sync by default and essentially just do the next, it will install SQL Express. SQL Express has a limit of 10 gig inside that database. Based on testing that we've done internally, we've calculated that around about 50,000 objects would mean that you reach that 10 gig limit. So if you have more than 50,000 objects inside Active Directory, which depending on the organization, obviously if you're a large organization, you probably will. Smaller organizations probably won't. And therefore you can get away with SQL Express. If you have more than 50,000 objects, then you need to install full SQL or install directory sync, and there's some additional switches that you need to do to be able to point that to full SQL, so it's not just the sort of standard install. Again, all that's sort of documented on the Office 365 community sites anyway. And the way to determine whether you actually have 50,000 objects or not is you can actually run the deployment readiness analyzer tool. So again, you can download that from the Office 365 community site, the Office 365 deployment readiness analyzer tool, and you run that within inside your organization, and it will tell you how many objects that you've got that will be syncing up to Office 365. So obviously as part of the sort of design process or the due diligence and remediation and server build, you can determine whether actually you can get away with SQL Express and whether you're near that limit or whether actually you do need to install that on full SQL. Now when you install the directory sync tool, it will ask you for your enterprise admin credentials. So it will only ask you once for those credentials, and as soon as you click next, what it does is it creates the directory sync account in Active Directory that has the required attributes to be able to sync up to Office 365, so to be able to read your environment and then synchronize to Office 365, and then it dismisses the enterprise admin credentials that you've presented. It only needs those enterprise admin credentials to create these sync accounts that it then uses going forward. So there shouldn't be any security issues there, hopefully. So yeah, we said 32-bit version of the directory sync appliance is no longer supported, and as I said, if we want to use multi-forest, then we use this Office 365 connector, which is the more complex scenarios. There's a couple of caveats that we've got at the bottom here. So when you're installing full SQL, you need to make sure the enterprise admin account has sysadmin rights on the SQL database, and that the DirSync service account has public permissions on the DirSync database as well. Otherwise, you may have issues when you install DirSync. So we've also got some scoping and filtering options that you can now do with directory sync. So fairly recently supported. Can't remember the exact dates, but good 6 months or so, where essentially you can now exclude objects from synchronizing up to Office 365, and you can manage these through the properties of the Source AD management agent. And this enables you to select which OUs and which domains you want to sync to the cloud, and you can also specify which objects you don't want to sync to the cloud. So for example, you could on-premise, you could add a particular string into a particular attribute, so you could put no sync in the extension attribute 15 for each user on-prem that you don't want to sync to the cloud. So maybe a service account or something like that. One thing to be aware though is you need to be very careful when you're doing scoping and filtering synchronization. So let's say for example you're filtering based on organizational units, so you only want a subset of OUs that sync up to Office 365. You go on holiday and then somebody else comes in and unticks an OU from the synchronization scope, then that OU and all of those objects within inside that OU have been taken out of the sync to Office 365. Therefore, all of those objects in Office 365 will be deleted. So you have to be very careful about setting any of the scoping and filtering. You don't want to accidentally delete any of those objects in Office 365. So we also mentioned that there's some multi-forest AD. So again, if you've got multiple on-premise Active Directory and you want to synchronize to Office 365, we use the Forefront Identity Manager, the FIM on-prem solution, to be able to collate all of those objects into one central location and then synchronize those to Office 365 using the Office 365 connector. As we've said, you may want to also have Visual Studio to help with some of the rules that you need to set up for FIM. And one thing to note here is currently multiple exchange organizations is not supported. So when we talk about multiple Active Directories, we're essentially talking about like a resource forest model where we've got two Active Directory forests, some with user accounts in and some with Exchange, and in that instance we can sync to Office 365, but at the moment we don't support having Exchange in both of those on-premise Active Directory environments. So multiple AD is fine as long as you've only got one Exchange org that you want to synchronize up to Office 365. Also, we've said we need the FIM install of Directory Sync to be able to sync from non-AD up again into Office 365 or essentially into the Windows Azure Active Directory. So again, we install FIM, collate all of our information from this LDAP store or LDAP directory, and then using the Office 365 FIM connector, we synchronize that up into Office 365. And I believe, Josh, that's about where we are. So I know there's been a few questions and things coming through.
Yeah, great presentation. Thanks, Daniel. Also, before we dive into the Q&A, now's a good time. If you posted a question earlier, let's just keep things simple for Daniel. If you can go ahead and copy and paste those questions back in, and then we can start fresh. I want to promote that Daniel is giving another presentation next week. So we have a great discussion about cutover and staged migrations. That'll be a week from today. That'll be at noon. So this was at 9 a.m. Pacific. That'll be at 12 Pacific. And you can find out more information on these links that I just pasted in. And so go ahead and copy and paste all those questions that you didn't have answered. And I also want you, I'm going to ask a couple survey questions while Daniel's answering those. And yeah, we'll see how far we get. So Daniel, can you go ahead and see some of those questions coming in?
Yep, I can see them now, yep. Okay, so Michael posted one there. Does do password sync now, or is that coming in 2013? So that's coming in 2013, so we don't currently support password sync at the moment. So hopefully, at the moment we're saying the first half of this calendar year, but of course that could be subject to change as well. Does the scenario involving FIM leverage? So with FIM, FIM will also leverage the password sync. I think that's the question. If that's not actually your question, then just repost your additional question. But yeah, I mean FIM does leverage the password sync, but again, that's not available currently at the moment. Okay, can only active sync be blocked using access control policy, i.e. not disabling active sync on a mailbox? So you can disable active sync through the service itself, so through Office 365, and there are some scripts out there actually, I believe, that allow you to be able to just disable active sync on I mean it's a per user basis, so it may have to be something like a scheduled task that would need to run. But I don't know if you're specifically referring there to control access policies through Adfs. If you are, so can only active sync be blocked? So I think we probably still could do that. Again, it'd be a customized rule if you only wanted to block active sync, so you wanted to allow everything else, so full rich Outlook clients, web access. You probably would be able to put a rule in there to block active sync. But if you refer to there's a TechNet article on the client policies, and that gives you some scenarios, so you may be able to work through those scenarios and customize the policy for your requirement. So when will Server 2012 be supported for ADFS? So we're working through that at the moment. I don't believe there's a timeline on that yet, unfortunately, because Server 2012 also supports Server 2012 also has ADFS 2.1, which is currently not supported for connecting to Office 365 yet either, but obviously we're working on that, so hopefully that should be fairly soon, but I don't have a date, unfortunately. Can Outlook connect to Office 365 via ActiveSync Exchange functionality, or only IM/POP? So I mean, yeah. So Outlook. So can Outlook connect to Office 365? We're talking about the full rich Outlook client here. This is Mike's question. So the full Outlook client will connect to Office 365 via RPC over HTTPS. So when your mailbox is on premise and then you migrate that mailbox to Office 365, so let's assume you do that using the hybrid, you've got hybrid in place and you do a hybrid migration, then it will automatically reconfigure your profile to point to Office 365, and at that instance it will also change it to use RPC over HTTPS. And you can also connect your Outlook client over IMAP and POP. So currently our minimum requirements for accessing Office 365 over RPC over HTTPS is using Outlook 2007 and Outlook 2010. So 2007 is the minimum. But if you want to use Outlook 2003 to connect to Office 365, then you can use Outlook 2003, but only for POP and IMAP. So it wouldn't be supported to use RPC over HTTPS. Hopefully that makes sense. What do I compromise if I don't use a proxy? So if you're not using an ADFS proxy, then you would essentially be opening up access. I mean, it's only port 443, but you'd essentially be opening up port 443 from the internet into your corporate network or your specific ADFS servers. So there's just a potential there of a security compromise. Hence the reason why the ADFS server proxy server would sit in the front from a security perspective. But also remember that we've said all full rich Outlook clients would always connect to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online would proxy you to the proxy server. So we require that proxy server in there if you want to be able to connect using rich Outlook clients. Is it recommended to have individual servers for each domain controller's ADFS server and DirSync server? For each domain controllers, I'm not sure I understand that question, but if I try and interpret what that means, so essentially you would have dedicated ADFS servers internally. You would have a dedicated directory sync server, and your ADFS server sitting in the DMZ, and the internal ADFS server would talk directly to your domain controllers, so it wouldn't need to be a specific domain controller. It could just be any domain controller that it can reach. And then I think we've got one. So we've got just one more question there, actually. I think that's from Jared. So our customer relationship management system downloads some users' email via POP to display them into the CRM application. If we integrate ADFS, what would happen to the passwords, to the password they use to access the account? Is it a local AD, or since it is a token, would there be? Oops. I just posted something else in there that just jumped. Maybe a different password. Customer relationship management system downloads email. So in order to access that mailbox, then yeah, it would essentially be an on-premise password. So if you move that mailbox to Office 365, then the password would still be managed on-premise. So that application would need access to be able to get to its mailbox in Office 365, but the password would still be managed via on-prem. So I think that would be okay, actually. Okay, that's good. Answered that question about servers. Where are we? So, for a backup scenario, can you walk through how it would look using ADFS and AD in Azure? Currently running Office 365 federated with on-prem ADFS and AD using FIM for syncing. The goal is to have HA without relying on on-prem ADFS and AD servers. Yeah, so at the moment with Windows Azure AD, that's just in preview. So at the moment we don't support or recommend to have your VMs for ADFS and AD running in there currently. Of course, going forward, once that comes out of preview and goes to general availability, then essentially you could have your ADFS servers running from Azure and your AD controllers in there as well. Yeah. I mean, essentially you could also use that as a DR or a HA. So you could obviously stretch that across from your current environment and have two ADFS servers, for example, sitting in Azure and two ADFS servers sitting on premise, and some form of either internet or global load balancer that sits between those two locations. Where can we? I've got a few more questions coming in.
Yeah, and I think for that one,
where can we escalate? Yep.
Yeah, I would go to the Office 365 community online, community.office365.com. You can try to escalate there. Right.
Okay. Cool. Thanks. Is there a recommended solution for small businesses to deploy ADFS sync solution without requiring so many resource servers? If I understand it correctly, I need 2 ADFS Windows sync, internal 2 ADFS proxy at minimum. Yeah, so that's why we're looking at the password synchronization. So that would be a better fit. Of course, you would just need the one server, which would then synchronize up to Office 365 and do the password synchronization, and therefore you wouldn't have the requirement for ADFS and all that on-premise infrastructure. So the password synchronization fits quite nicely into that type of model. As I say, it's not fully released yet, but we're hoping for something in the first half of this calendar year, so that would be a good fit for that scenario. Okay, is the failure to add additional servers to the ADFS farm an issue with all wildcard certs in general, or does it apply only when the service domain? I believe it's just when the service domain does not match the wildcard cert. Yeah. Yeah, when you add the other server in. Yeah, that's the experience that I've seen anyway. Is there any documentation or online session available for debugging ADFS issues with Fiddler? Good question. I'm not sure actually. There are some MSODAL, I think it is, which can be used for tracing. But I don't know if there's anything specifically on there for Fiddler. I'm not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, I would say just maybe go to the community site and search that one too.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that's them all.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, that was an excellent presentation. Remember that Daniel's giving us another fantastic presentation on cutover and stage migrations next week. So stick around for that next week. We hope to see you there. Thanks again to Daniel and everyone here.